Have you ever wondered if one day the person you put all your trust in turned around and left you in the middle of the street in front of the whole town? How would you stand? In Red Willow, a small town in the middle of the windy Montana in the late 19th century, that was the moment that marked the biggest event in Clara Ellsworth's life. Being handed divorce papers by her ex-husband Thomas Ellsworth, as if he were throwing away an object being replaced by another woman, she not only lost her family, but also lost her honor in a community that was strict with abandoned women. But life on the frontier is always harsh when we are at our weakest, and at that very moment it forces us to face a choice that no one can avoid, give up or stand up. If you were Clara, what would you do when the empty house turned its back on you, when the whole town looked at you with pity and the only sound was the wind whistling through the window? Would you have the courage to believe that your life was not over, when everything seemed to be pushing you into the darkest depths? Then, out of the red Montana sunset, a man appeared, Boone Carter, slow, steady, and carrying with him a fate-changing line. He left gold for dust. What made Boone see the value in a woman the world had turned its back on? And why did that statement set off the most beautiful healing journey of Clara's life? Join us as we embark on a story, a reminder that even in the harshest lands the human heart can find light. If you love healing stories with the spirit of the West, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to accompany us. Let's begin. That afternoon, the wind carried a dry, dusty smell from the southern hills down the main street of Red Willow. The rhythmic beat of horse hooves on the compacted ground was dry and hollow like the sound of an empty barrel. The last rays of sunlight fell on the worn wooden eaves, making the town look like an old photograph that someone had just gently brushed away the dust of time. Clara Ellsworth stood still in front of the land office, a small red brick house with a high roof and shadowed windows. She had no idea how long she stood there. All she could feel was her heart suddenly becoming too heavy to lift, and her hands too light to hold anything. Before her, Thomas Ellsworth, the husband who had promised to protect her until his last breath, held out a piece of paper. Not with courtesy, not with shame. He handed it over as if it were a worthless object, like someone tossing a pair of torn gloves into a wooden crate. Clara, Thomas said, his voice flat and tired, as if she were the reason his life was in such disarray. This is what's best for both of us. Before she could reply, Thomas turned away his strong hand on the back of another woman, Phoebe Marlowe. Once Clara's parishioner, Phoebe now stood in the place Clara thought would be hers for the rest of her life. Phoebe's eyes lingered on Clara's face for a moment. It wasn't a look of triumph. It was a mixture of embarrassment and pride, a kind of guilt that wasn't honest enough nor cruel enough to turn away immediately. On her lips there was still a half smile, the kind that curved just enough to remind Clara how quickly the world could change. Thomas helped Phoebe into the waiting black carriage. As the wooden wheels rolled, dust swirled up as if the town itself were trying to block out the scene, a scene so heartbreaking that everyone on the street tried to look away, but no one really looked away. An old newspaper vendor, sitting under the old awning of Morgan's grocery store, cleared his throat. He'd seen more tragedy than anyone in Red Willow, but he still couldn't get used to people throwing each other away like old-fashioned junk. He looked at Thomas and Phoebe as they moved away, and muttered loud enough for Clara to hear. Some men can't tell the difference between gold and desert dust. A few passers-by hesitated. A few housewives set down their vegetable baskets. A few cowboys stopped at the saloon, but no one approached. Not because they didn't care for the young woman standing alone in the middle of Main Street, but because on the frontier, pain was sometimes something you had to bear alone before someone could help. Clara's eyes still silently followed the carriage as it drove away. She did not shout, did not blame, did not cry. The grief within her was like the winter sky, heavy, silent, and without warning of snow. The wind blew harder, carrying the smell of burning wood from the Westwood bakery. Fine dust clung to the hem of her dress, but Clara didn't bother brushing it away. She just took a long, slow, shaky breath, as if trying to find her voice. The divorce papers were still in her hands, the edges cold against her skin. It was more than just the end of a marriage. It was a declaration that she had no one to stand by her side, no man in the town to claim her, and perhaps no home to return to. They say on the frontier women have to be stronger than men to survive. But those who say that have never stood on Main Street having their backs turned by someone they trusted in front of the whole town on an afternoon when the dry wind tickles their heels. Clara clenched her hand, trying to keep the paper from being blown away by the wind. She didn't want to lose anything more, not even a piece of paper that carried so much humiliation. In that moment, the town of Red Willow spread out before her, the wooden houses, the old lantern, the little church on the east hill with its tilted bell. For years she had walked these streets as a wife, a woman of substance. Now the town looked at her differently, not with contempt, just with silence. Silence sometimes speaks louder than accusations. Clara took another deep breath and bowed her head. The afternoon sun cast a long shadow across the edge of the road, a thin, solitary silhouette. But even the shadow was no longer complete. It was fragmented by the flying dust. "God," she whispered, "is this how you end my story?" The wind responded with a long, dry howl, like a person panting after a tiring journey. No one heard Clara's question but herself, and no one answered. But in those ashen eyes slowly lifting, there was something warmer than numbness. Not hope, just a little bit of pride left over from all the years she'd spent trying to be a good woman, a pride Thomas couldn't crush, no matter how hard he tried. Clara took a step forward, not to chase anyone, but to keep from standing still any longer. With the afternoon wind still whipping up dust in circles, she felt like this piece of land, dry, battered, but still standing through droughts. Because the border woman, once she has stood in the sandstorm, is brave enough to keep going even when everything familiar has walked away. And though Clara left Main Street that day with her feet still firmly on the ground, she had no idea that the most painful thing wasn't the moment Thomas left. It was what awaited her at the small house where she once believed she belonged. The story picks up from the moment Clara leaves Main Street, walking through the dusty afternoon wind. And it's as the sound of horse hooves fades behind her that she knows that pain is only the beginning, and what awaits her in the low hills north of Red Willow will make her heart hit the ground again. The way home was longer than usual. Or perhaps it was her feet that had slowed down, as if she wanted to buy a little more time before facing the truth. Each step made the hem of her dress lightly brush against the weeds along the roadside, emitting a very small sound like the sigh of someone who no longer believed she was strong enough to say anything big. As the cabin appeared behind the red willows, a chill ran down Clara's spine. The front door wasn't completely shut. It was ajar, shaking slightly in the wind like a weak hand trying to hold on to something that had gone away. Clara stood still for a moment. She had never seen her front door open like that since she had become a daughter-in-law of the Ellsworths. Thomas was a meticulous man. He locked it even when he was gone for only 5 minutes. Yet now the door was wide open like a confession. She pushed the door open, the hinges creaking softly like someone groaning in exhaustion. Inside was desolation. The wooden money chest was overturned, the lock broken, the boards torn off. Thomas's clothes were strewn across the floor, but the important things, what belonged to Clara, were gone. The drawer where she had kept her mother's embroidered handkerchief was empty, but for a rag. Her father's tea set, the only gift he had left her before he died, was gone too. Clara did not cry immediately. Frontier women were accustomed to holding back tears, as one might hold back a fire on a snowy night. Only her heart clenched, aching so much that she had to hold onto the table to steady herself. Her eyes stopped at the wedding photo on the wooden shelf by the window. The frame was tilted, the glass cracked like a dried spider web. The largest piece of glass fell to the floor, breaking into small, sparkling pieces like frozen tears. In the photo, Thomas smiled, the gentle smile Clara had trusted for 7 years. And now it seemed like a stranger's smile. A strong wind blew through the window, swirling dust into the room. The photograph tilted a little more, and then fell face down. Clara knelt down and picked up the photograph with trembling hands. Cracks ran across her face in the picture, a reminder that the pain tearing at her heart was shaped like those cracks. As the sunset turned purple, shadows began to creep into the corners of the house. An emptiness filled the room, as if the whole house knew Clara had been left behind and didn't know how to protect her. Clara walked to the kitchen table and reached for the only remaining oil lamp. Thomas had taken everything else he could sell or trade for money, but he had left the oil lamp. Maybe because it was too old. Maybe because it was too cheap. Maybe because he didn't think Clara would need a light where her life was fading. She lit the fire. The flame flickered like her own weak breath. Clara hugged the lamp to her chest, not because she was cold, but because she wanted to keep that small light so she wouldn't feel empty. A sentence emerged from the bottom of the heart, slow, broken, but full of faith worn by time. If God closes a door, he must be holding another way for me. I just don't know if I can wait to see it. The Red Willow night was so quiet that she could hear the wind rustling through the cracks in the walls, and the bamboo strips on the roof loosening in the cold. Everything around her breathed at a very slow pace, like the pace of life of people who were used to enduring, used to getting up with their own two hands no matter how many times they fell. Clara put the lamp back on the table. The golden light fell on her face, illuminating her eyes, which were filled with sadness but not extinguished. There was something in those eyes that made one want to believe that no matter how many blows life dealt her, she still had the courage to not give up. In the silence of the night, Clara felt smaller than ever. But in that smallness, something began to grow, something she did not immediately recognize. It was not hope. Hope is a fragile thing, it comes and goes. What had just grown inside her was the smoldering determination of someone who had hit rock bottom but still had two legs to stand on. Clara took one last look around the house, then blew out the light. Darkness fell immediately, but she did not retreat. On the frontier, darkness was only a sign that dawn would come late but never forgotten. And strangely enough, it was the morning after that dark night that opened up a new path for Clara, not an easy one, but the only one for her to continue on with empty hands but a warm heart. The morning after that long night came more gently than Clara had expected. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the old curtains, falling on the windowsill like a gentle sign that life, however broken, continued to operate in its cycles. Clara sat up slowly, still feeling tired but not as empty as last night. The woman who had stood upright in the middle of Main Street yesterday, abandoned, was still there inside her, and it was that woman that had given Clara the courage to get out of bed today. She put on the oldest blue dress she had left. The fabric was frayed, the seams loose and tight, but Clara spent the night pressing the pleats and sewing the torn hem. On the frontier, a decent dress was sometimes more than clothing. It was the last vestige of dignity a woman carried with her as she searched for a way to survive. Clara turned onto Red Willow's Main Street, where red dust still rose in waves with the hooves of men preparing for the lumber hauling season. Each person glanced at her, not unkindly but a small-town reflex, where a private story is hard to keep private for long. The first place Clara stopped was the Riverbend Inn. The landlady, Belinda Hayes, who had smiled at Clara every time she dropped off her mail, was standing behind the counter, her hands clasped together, her eyes apologetic. "Clara," she sighed softly, "I wish I could take you on. But a woman left behind like you can't work in an inn where men stay overnight. People will talk too much." Clara kept her voice calm. "I understand, Mrs. Hayes. Thank you for telling the truth." The landlady watched her go, and her face spoke of the sadness of a good person who was not strong enough to fight against local prejudice. Clara continued to Larch & Sons, the tailor shop where she bought her embroidery thread every winter. The owner, Mr. Larch, was so embarrassed that he could not even look her in the eye. "Miss Ellsworth, I don't want to get involved with the Thomases. This is a small town. Whoever partners with you now might lose customers." Clara nodded, accepting another door closing in her face. She didn't blame them. She had heard similar stories about other women in the area. The midday sun cast long shadows on the dirt road, making Clara's figure dwarf the vastness of the town. For hours she went from store to store, but the answer was always the same, a gentle but firm refusal, like someone closing a window to keep out the cold wind. As the sun was high in the sky, Clara stopped in front of the Red Willow Library, a low, sloping wooden house nestled among the red willows. She hadn't meant to go in. Libraries didn't offer much for a woman abandoned by her husband, but her feet seemed to find their way there, perhaps because Clara needed a breather from her mounting frustrations. The smell of old paper and wood dust was calming in the library. The elderly librarian, Martha Doyle, was rearranging books on the shelves. Her eyes were bright but quiet, the kind of gaze of someone who has seen more turmoil than they care to recount. "Mrs. Doyle put the book down on the table, observed Clara for a long time before speaking. "You seem to have been through more than a young woman should in a day." Clara smiled slightly, just enough to keep from sighing. "I'm just looking for a job, ma'am. Any job, as long as I can pay for food and coal this winter." Mrs. Doyle tilted her head. "Then maybe you've come to the right place." Clara looked at her with surprise. "But does the library need people?" "Not the library." Mrs. Doyle took a bunch of old keys and put them on the table. "It's the little school behind the church. The children here need someone to teach them how to read and write. And the town needs to see you standing in front of a chalkboard, not standing alone in the street." Clara pursed her lips. "But I don't think anyone wants anything to do with me right now." Mrs. Doyle looked straight into her eyes, her voice dropping to a very light sentence, but enough to make Clara's heart tremble. Teach the children to read. Then this town will learn to look at you again. There are words that come just in time not to save you, but to remind you that you still have value. And that was just what Clara needed after a long morning of fruitless job hunting. The two of them walked out into the courtyard behind the library where a few students were playing during recess. A little blonde girl looked up at Clara, her blue eyes filled with curiosity. When she smiled back, the child ran up to her and grabbed the hem of her skirt. "Are you the new teacher?" Clara was stunned for a moment. It had been a long time since anyone had called her by a title that made her heart feel so light. She knelt down at the child's eye level. "If you want to learn to read, you'll have to see if I can do it." The child giggled and ran off to call his friend. Mrs. Doyle looked at the scene and smiled kindly. "You see, children don't care about scandal. They just want to learn, and they want someone to believe in them." Clara watched the children play in the sun. Something inside her softened like a string that had been taut since yesterday had finally loosened. "I will," said Clara. "No matter how little the pay, no matter what anyone says, I will teach." Mrs. Doyle nodded, her eyes sparkling with the trust of someone who had seen many lives mended through small acts. And in that moment, in the dusty red schoolyard of Red Willow, Clara learned that sometimes the path of life is not opened by great victories, but by a very small opening of a door enough for someone who has not given up to step through. And it was those afternoons when Clara stood in front of the chalkboard, her voice reading slowly in the wooden room, that led her to an unexpected encounter with a border man with old wounds, but whose heart quietly burned like embers in the long night. Clara's first days teaching at the little schoolhouse behind the church helped keep her mind occupied. The children of Red Willow knew little of adult sorrow, and it was an unexpected balm for her, but even that small joy was not enough to ease her fatigue. The work was hard, the food was scarce, the nights were long, and autumn was about to chill the hills. One weekend afternoon, as Clara left class to return to her small house, she felt a little dizzy. Hunger, lack of sleep, and the quiet stress of many days had made her legs weak. The sun cast a thin layer of gold over the red soil of Red Willow, washing the town in a nostalgic hue. In the light, the silhouette of a man standing by the school's wooden fence suddenly appeared, silent, tall, and as calm as the Montana mountains in winter. Boone Carter. The name was familiar to almost everyone in Red Willow. Some said he was a drifter who traveled around Montana ranches trading labor for meals. Others said he had lost an important woman in his life and had since become quiet, not interested in making friends. But everyone agreed on one thing: Boone would never do anything unkind. He stood there, his hands in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. The afternoon sunlight stretched his shadow on the ground like a lonely but determined brushstroke on a border landscape. Clara stopped short at the sight of him, but before she could say hello, a slight jolt made her lean forward. In that instant, Boone stepped forward with the reflexes of a man who had saved many lives on the trail. His hand touched Clara's arm, steadying her. Just enough. Then when he saw that she was okay, he let go, a respect that made Clara feel like an equal, not a weakling who needed saving. Clara let out a small breath. "Thank you. I'm just a little tired." Boone bowed his head slightly, his voice deep, warm, but restrained like all men on the frontier. "A man who stands in class all week and eats only breadcrumbs will fall down no matter how strong he is, ma'am." She was surprised, but Boone didn't give her a chance to defend herself. He looked her straight in the eye, no judgment, no pity, just a calm look, as if he had seen too much loss in his life to judge anyone. "Ma'am," Boone said slowly, each word falling like a pebble on a dry pond, "your husband threw away a diamond because he didn't know how to polish it." Clara stood still. On the frontier, men didn't often say things like that. They didn't speak with soft words. They spoke with actions, with silence, with shoulders broad enough to withstand storms. But Boone, a man whose eyes had seen more than he cared to tell, said it as if he understood Clara's heart needed a confirmation of the value she herself was trying to hold. A light breeze blew, stirring the hem of Clara's skirts. She turned her face toward the sunset, not wanting Boone to see her red eyes. "I am not worthy to be compared to a diamond, Mr. Carter." Boone inclined his head slightly, his voice as deep as heavy wood being placed on a floor. "Ma'am, diamonds don't know their worth. It takes a wise man to see it." Clara didn't know what to say. At Red Willow, compliments from men were usually polite or light flirtations. But Boone's words were neither. They were like what one storm-wielding man said to another storm-wielding man, few words but true enough to be a crutch. They walked the short distance to Clara's house. Neither of them said anything else. But the silence wasn't heavy. It was like the silence between two people who knew that the most important things didn't have to be said in a hurry. When he reached the gate, Boone stopped. He looked around the old log house that had stood the test of time. "If you need someone to fix your roof before the snow," he said, "I'll be in town for a few weeks. Call me if you want." Clara tugged at the hem of his shirt, gratitude rising to her like the warmth of an old fire. "I'll consider it. Thank you, really." Boone nodded, took 2 steps back, then turned and walked into the sunset. His shadow stretched across the red earth, an image enough to make Clara's heart vibrate for the first time in months, like the thin strings of a violin touched by the wind. She stood in the doorway watching him. No hope, no confusion, just a touch of warmth as rare as late autumn sunshine on a cold meadow. And sometimes that's all it takes to make a person start to believe that the future can be different. And it was from Boone's quiet request that Red Willow entered a new season. A season where each afternoon the sound of hammers on Clara's roof mingled with the wind, ushering in days of rebuilding not just a house, but 2 souls slowly finding their place in the harsh frontier. In the days after that first meeting, Red Willow transformed into late autumn. The town was a pale yellow, and layers of red willow leaves fell in front of Clara's schoolyard. Children cheered as the wind blew, and adults knew winter was coming, and leaky roofs, broken fences, and the hustle and bustle of making a living waited for no one. One Saturday morning, Boone Carter appeared at Clara's front door, a wooden toolbox in his hand. He waited for her to open the door, not impatient, not imposing. Just the kind of silence that frontier men have, slow, steady, and respectful. "Do you want to start with the roof or the fence first?" Boone asked. Clara was a little confused, then smiled slightly. "The front roof, if you don't mind." "The snow will probably come early this year." Boone nodded. "This is your land, Clara. You decide." The remark sounded simple, but to Clara it carried more weight than a promise. For years, Thomas had called the shots in this house, from where the nails were driven to where the chairs were placed. For the first time in her life, someone had asked what she meant. Boone began removing rotten boards from the roof. Clara, though new to the job, wanted to help. She borrowed Boone's hammer, heavy wooden handle, thick head, a far cry from the small tools she had been allowed to use. "Are you sure you can do this?" Boone asked, but his voice wasn't doubtful, just worried. Clara gripped the hammer handle tightly. It felt strangely steady. "I want to try. I don't want to spend the rest of my life being told women can't do this." Boone looked at her a long moment, then placed the board in front of her. "Try it then. No rush." Clara raised the hammer. The first blow missed. The second was better. By the third, the nail was buried as neatly as the best coffin maker in town. Boone smiled, a small smile, but enough to warm the chilly room. "Not bad at all." Clara did not smile back, but in her heart there was something like the late afternoon sunlight, not dazzling, but enough to dispel the darkness. They continued working side by side. The silence between them did not bother Clara. On the contrary, it felt peaceful, like listening to the wind and the hammers blend into a quiet melody. By noon, the wind from the mountains had picked up. Boone was about to warn her when a large board was ripped off and hurtled toward Clara. It all happened so fast, all she could hear was the howling wind and the leaves that whipped at her face. Boone reacted almost instinctively. He wrapped his arms around Clara and pulled her away from the swaying roof. Their weight brought them both to the ground, landing on the dry grass at the foot of the house. The fall wasn't hard, but it was enough to make Clara's heart skip a beat. She lay still for a few seconds, feeling Boone's breathing still slow and steady beside her. When he pulled away, Clara realized that Boone's hand on her arm had only squeezed for a brief moment, just enough to make sure she was safe, then he was gone. "I'm sorry," Boone said softly. "I didn't mean to overstep." Clara shook her head, her voice as small as a passing breeze. "No. You saved me." They looked at each other longer than usual, longer than two strangers usually allowed. In Boone's eyes, Clara saw the calm of someone who had suffered much loss. In Clara's eyes, Boone saw a woman trying to stand on her own 2 feet. No one said anything more. No need to. That afternoon, as they continued to repair the roof, the distance between them didn't shrink, but it didn't seem as far apart as before. Boone asked Clara's opinion on every board, every nail. Clara offered to do the things Thomas had forbidden her to do herself. And Boone, by quietly stepping back and letting her do it, gave Clara something she hadn't had in years: full control of her own home. By sundown, the roof was in good shape, at least enough to withstand the first gust of wind. Boone gathered up his tools and Clara stood beside him, her arms wrapped around her elbows for warmth. "Thank you for helping me," Clara said slowly. "I don't know how I would have gotten through these days without you." Boone looked straight into her tired but bright eyes. "You made it through on your own, Clara. I just helped hold up a few planks." She laughed softly. It was a small laugh, but Boone heard it, and he treasured it like a rare treasure. They parted at the gate as two people who knew this was not the end of the story. No rush, no promises, but something growing warm, like embers under a thin layer of ash. And it seemed that the earth and sky also felt that change, because just a few days later a big storm came from the western mountains. A storm that not only tested Clara's roof, but also tested the feelings that were still quietly forming between two people who did not dare to call each other's names. The days of repairing the roof went more smoothly than Clara had anticipated, but the Montana weather in late autumn never promised anything lasting. A few days later, as the morning mist slowly melted from the grass, the town of Red Willow began to hear the sound farmers feared, a long, deep, horn-like howl from the mountains to the west. Clara was cleaning her classroom when the first strong wind swept through the schoolyard. The red willow leaves swirled in the air and were thrown against the glass doors. The chalkboard shook slightly on the wall. The last child ran home just in time to see the wind pick up. When Clara stepped out of the classroom, the sky was ashen. The clouds rolled like coal dust blown from the bottom of an old furnace, casting the town into an ominous silence. It wasn't the silence of a peaceful evening. It was the silence of a moment before it all began. Clara ran home, clutching her shawl as the wind began to grip her shoulders like rough hands. The ground beneath her feet became increasingly blurred in the red dust that rose in billows so high that they obscured the wooden fences along the road. As she stepped onto the doorstep, a voice called from behind, low, familiar, and carrying an undisguised worry. Clara Boone Carter emerged from the red dust like a silhouette from a sunburned frontier painting. His leather jacket was thick with dust, his hair was tangled in the wind, but his eyes were as clear as an oil lamp that had never burned out. "This storm is bigger than I thought," Boone said, moving closer. "Do you have enough water, enough firewood?" Clara shook her head, the wind whipping her hair against her cheeks. "I don't know. I've never felt wind this strong." Boone glanced up at the sky where thunder rolled in the chests of dark clouds that were gathering close to the ground. "You should close the door right now." "I'll..." He started to step back from the porch, but Clara grabbed his sleeve, an action so unexpected that even she felt her heart skip a beat. "Boone, don't go. Not tonight. Not in this storm." Clara's hand was cold, but her grip wasn't weak. It was like the grip of someone who had been used to being alone for too long and had finally found a support that didn't make them feel ashamed. Boone looked down at the hand, then into Clara's ashen eyes, eyes filled with worry but not pleading. She didn't need him to save her. She just didn't need to be alone. After a moment's hesitation, Boone nodded. "Okay, I'll stay." The wind blew hard, blowing the door behind Clara against the wall. Boone pushed it open for her, both of them struggling to hold it shut. When the door slammed shut, the house was plunged into darkness, lit only by the small oil lamp Clara switched on with trembling hands. Outside, the wind whistled in long, sharp tendrils. Red dust whipped against the wooden walls like sand splatters hurled by a giant invisible hand. Each gust shook the roof as if testing its strength. Clara turned the oil lamp to give it a brighter light. Boone stood a few feet away, but his presence made the small room feel less empty. He brushed the dust off his shirt, but his eyes followed Clara as if to make sure she was okay. "Do you often get storms like this?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes." Boone sat down on the wooden chair, his hands on his knees. "This kind of storm comes fast and goes fast. But it can take a roof off a house overnight." Clara looked up at the ceiling where the boards they had mended together still held firm despite the strong winds. "Thanks to you, my roof hasn't blown off." Boone chuckled. "Thanks to you for hammering those nails straighter than I could." The light of the oil lamp reflected off their faces. Clara put the handkerchief down on the table, feeling a little better. "You know, it's been months since I've felt so unafraid of the night." Boone tilted his head, his eyes softening. "The scariest night is always the night you have to face alone." Clara stared at him for a moment longer. Outside, the thunder rumbled as if it were pulling the sky down to earth, but inside the small house a kind of peace began to form. They sat across from each other, an old wooden table in the middle, an oil lamp burning slowly like a recovering heart. Clara spoke first, her voice soft. I grew up on a small farm in eastern Dakota. My father was a man of few words, but every fall he would say, "The wind brought a reminder to be kind, no matter how cruel the winter." Boone listened, his eyes never leaving her face. When my parents died, Clara continued, I thought I would find a home again by marrying Thomas. But maybe I was wrong. I tried to hold on to something that no longer belonged to me. Boone nodded slowly. I know how that feels. Clara looked at him surprised. Boone never spoke of his life. He leaned back in his chair, his voice low like the sigh of a pine forest at night. Once upon a time I had a family, a good wife, a little boy, barely old enough to play in hay. But that winter, Montana's fiercest winter, they didn't make it. The oil lamp flickered slightly. Clara said nothing. Her heart felt like it was tied into a tight knot. I left the farm after that, Boone continued. I went from place to place doing all kinds of jobs. I thought if I hadn't stopped I wouldn't have had to face that void. Clara whispered. But that void still follows you. Boone looked at her, his eyes like the last flame of a campfire. Yes, it followed me. Until the day I saw a woman standing on Main Street holding divorce papers, her back straight as if she wanted to fight the world. The room was so quiet that Clara could hear herself breathing. Not because of the compliment, but because she realized someone had seen her pain, for real, unvarnished, unpitying. The wind whipped against the windows. The house shook slightly, but in that moment Clara was no longer afraid. Boone, the man sitting across from her, spoke the truth in the voice of a man who had lost more than he dared to tell. Thank you, Clara said, for staying. Boone just shook his head. I stayed because I wanted to. Their eyes met no longer the gaze of two strangers, but of two souls recognizing each other in a tiny moment amid the howling wind. None of them called it love. It didn't need to be. On the border, the deepest things often form quietly like a spring under the dry earth, needing only time to rise to the surface. The storm outside lasted until midnight, but inside the small house each story and each memory told in a slow voice had condensed into a warmth large enough to withstand the roar of thunder and the sweeping wind. When Clara smiled for the first time in months, Boone understood that some storms don't come to destroy but to make way for light. But peace on the border is always more fragile than one might think. And just a few days after that stormy night, the past, Clara thought, buried deep, suddenly returned, not gently, without warning, in the form of the man who had abandoned her on Red Willow Street. After that stormy night, Red Willow felt like it had been washed clean. The next morning the ground was still wet, and the late raindrops on the red willows glistened in the sunlight. To Clara that morning felt strange, as if the storm had blown not just through the roof but through her heart, clearing away the dark corners she thought she would carry with her forever. Boone left the house at dawn as silently as he always appeared and disappeared. He left only a gentle note: if the roof creaks when the wind changes direction at night, just call me. Clara stood in the doorway watching him through the mist in the air. A small smile appeared, then disappeared like a willow leaf lifted and dropped by the wind. But something in her heart remained warm enough to lighten the day. But the calm of the frontier was often just a pause between two great waves. And 3 days later the great wave came in the form of the man Clara had thought had left her life forever. Clara was packing up her classroom. The children had just left, and the playground was filled with laughter. The wind was gentle, the sun was gentle, the scene was so beautiful that no one could have guessed the terrible things that awaited her just beyond the old fence. The slow, heavy sound of hooves echoed from the end of the dirt road. Clara looked up, her gray eyes lingering as she saw the familiar but much disfigured figure Thomas Ellsworth. He wore his once proud suit, now soiled, creased, and slightly torn at the sleeves. His hair was matted with sweat and road dust, and his face was haggard but still carried the same old arrogance, the arrogance of someone used to being pampered and never thinking of the day when he would fall. Thomas stopped his horse right in front of the schoolyard. His eyes swept over Clara as if she were a forgotten object, then fixed on Boone, who had just come to pick up the bundles of firewood Clara had asked him to bring. Boone stood tall, his gaze as calm as a still lake. No challenge, no evasion, just the calm presence of a man accustomed to facing the storms of life. Thomas chuckled, his voice hoarse and gruff, tinged with the bitterness of a loser in gambling and life. So that's it, Clara, a drifter who fixes stables for hire. That's your idea of moving on. Thomas's voice was low, but it was loud enough to make the people standing in front of Morgan's grocery store turn to look. In a small town, private matters quickly became public. Boone didn't react. He just put the bundle of firewood on the ground, wiped his hands on his pants, and looked at Thomas calmly. I'm not stepping forward for anyone. I'm just here because she needs help. Thomas laughed, his laugh like a dull knife cutting through wood. She doesn't need you. Her land is mine. And I came back to claim it. Clara clenched the hem of her dress, but her voice did not tremble. You left this land, Thomas. And left me twice. Thomas leaned his elbows on the saddle, his eyes narrowing. I had a choice then. I don't have one now. I need this land to rebuild my life. Clara took a step forward. Build your life by destroying the rest of someone else's. A passerby stopped. The door of the old lantern was ajar, and a few curious eyes peered out. In the Red Willow, people were less likely to pry into private matters, but they still looked and looked closely. Thomas lowered his voice, but cut like a small knife. The law in Montana Territory is very clear. A woman without a husband, father, or brother cannot own land. This land is in my name, and I have come to take back what is mine. Boone took a step forward, not threateningly, but enough to show Thomas that he would not stand idly by while Clara was pushed to the brink. Clara took a deep breath. This was what she feared the most. Not losing her land, but being turned into a bone of contention between two men. Thomas, she said, her voice low and slow, as if each word had to overcome years of resentment. You have no right to be here. Thomas rode closer, his eyes flashing with anger. Do you think he will protect you? A homeless, rootless vagabond. I don't replace anyone. Boone replied in a voice so calm it dwarfed Thomas's. But I stand here, and you chose to leave. Clara looked straight at Thomas, and in that moment, her eyes no longer held the fear of someone abandoned, but the clarity of someone who knew her worth. You left me, Thomas. You left this land, and now you come back only to fail somewhere else. She shook her head. I have nothing left for you to take. The words made Thomas choke. Anger rose in his face, like too much alcohol. But underneath there was something like the humiliation of someone who had once stood tall, now reduced to his own failure. He jerked the reins and turned his horse. You will regret it. I will come back with the papers, and then you will be left with nothing. Boone said nothing. He just stood a little to Clara's side, a great shadow blocking the wind. As Thomas rode away, a cloud of dust rose behind him, high enough to blot out the sky for a moment. Clara stood still long after Thomas had disappeared. The evening breeze blew gently through the trembling willows. The curious villagers gradually dispersed, each looking at her with a mixture of pity and pity. Boone didn't ask if she was okay. He knew such questions were unnecessary when a woman's heart had just taken a new crack. Instead, he spoke in a low voice, as if to comfort the straining shoulders. Clara, you're not alone. She took a breath, then nodded. No tears. No shaking. The storm the day before had taught her that there were some things you could only get through if you stood firm, even when the whole world was trying to knock you down. But deep down, Clara knew the next storm wouldn't come from the sky, but from the past she thought was buried beneath the red dust of Red Willow. And before Clara could catch her breath from that confrontation, bad news spread through town. Thomas Ellsworth was filing suit in federal court, demanding that all of his land be taken back under old territorial law, a law that a woman like Clara could never win unless she had a man on her side. The news of Thomas Ellsworth's lawsuit spread through Red Willow overnight. In this frontier town, good news travels slowly, while bad news travels quickly like the wind across the prairie. Clara heard the news from the owner of Westwood Bakery. She placed the loaf of bread on the table, slowly dusting off the flour, her eyes filled with concern. Clara, I heard Thomas went to the county court. She began, her voice trying to be gentle. He cited an old law, a Dakota Territory law, that women without a male relative could not legally own land. Clara stood still. The words fell on her like church bells on a gray winter day, heavy and sharp. That law, a law she had thought forgotten in moldy files, was now the knife Thomas had used to stab back into her life. He wants the land back, Clara asked, her voice calmer than she expected. Mrs. Westwood nodded. He said he would file a lawsuit in federal court within the next 10 days. 10 days. Just 10 days for Thomas to erase all the effort Clara had poured into the land she lived on with all her heart. Clara left the bakery with a small loaf of bread in her hand and walked slowly to the school where she taught. The sky was a silvery gray that day, reminding her of the harsh winters when her parents were there. But now, since stepping foot in Red Willow, she was alone and her fragile courage was being tested again. In the afternoon, Clara was called to a meeting of the town council. No one spoke directly about the accusations, but each look was heavy with speculation. The first to speak was Pastor Harold, who had witnessed Clara teaching children to recite prayers in her early days. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, "Red Willow is a small town. Word travels fast, and your ex-husband's lawsuit, it's tarnishing the school's image." Clara clenched her hands but kept her voice calm. "I didn't choose this path. Thomas left me in this land. I just keep on living." A woman in the council, the mother of a student, stood up, her voice filled with wariness. "Should a woman with such a troubled life be teaching our children?" The words hit Clara harder than the storm of a few nights ago. Harder than when Thomas had thrust divorce papers into her hands. Harder than when she had come home to an empty house. Not because it offended her, but because it touched on the abandoned woman's deepest fear, the fear of being seen as a blemish, even though she had done nothing wrong. Clara stood straighter, as if her spine was supported by the memory of her parents who had taught her that dignity never rested in the mouth of a judge. "I can't change what they say about me," Clara replied, "but I've never let my personal life affect the children." The other woman turned away, clearly unconvinced. The meeting ended in an awkward silence. As Clara left the room, Mrs. Doyle, the old librarian who had introduced her to the school, laid a hand gently on her shoulder. "Don't let their words get you down," she said. "Those who fear scandal are the loudest. Stand tall and they will look at you differently." Clara smiled weakly. "I'm just afraid. If the lawsuit really happens, they'll expel me from school." "You still have your hands in your heart, Mrs." Doyle replied firmly and kindly. "On the frontier, that is sometimes enough to start over." As it was getting dark, Clara returned home. But Boone was already standing on the porch, as if he knew she would need someone to stand with. His eyes searched her face. "Is the council giving you a hard time?" Clara put the cake on the table, sat down in a chair, and ran her hand along the edge of her scarf as if to calm herself. "They say a woman with a troubled life should not teach children." Boone sat down opposite, clasped his hands together, and spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Clara, you are not a troubled person. You are just someone who has suffered too much injustice." Clara pursed her lips, looking down at the floor as if looking into something deep in her heart. "And now, the law is on his side," she continued. "Old territorial laws. Laws written by men who didn't think women could stand alone." Boone tilted his head, his gaze heavy but soft. "The law may be outdated, but the truth is not. And the truth is Thomas left you. That's what the whole town sees." Clara sighed. "It's not the facts. It's the paperwork. If the lawsuit goes through, I'll lose my land. And probably my job and the life I've worked so hard to build." Boone tapped the edge of the table lightly, a small but reassuring gesture. "You're not alone in this." She looked up, her ash-gray eyes reflecting the oil lamplight like rippling lake surface. "But Boone, people will gossip if you side with me." Boone smiled ever so slightly, a rare smile. Clara had learned to reserve for when he wanted to lighten someone's mood. "On the border, people gossip about everything. I don't live to please them." There was a moment of silence between them, a silence not of two people afraid to say the wrong thing, but of two people knowing that the other's presence said it all. The next morning, word of the lawsuit spread further. Several parents stood in front of the school whispering. One of them, Mrs. Whitmore, did not try to keep her voice low. "I don't want my child to learn from a woman whose husband abandoned her and who got involved with a wandering cowboy." Clara heard clearly, and this pain was different from the others. It wasn't sharp, not sharp. It was dull, like a deep wound, half healed, but someone had touched it in the wrong place, and it hadn't had time to heal. Boone appeared shortly afterward, carrying some wood to repair the classroom door. When he saw Clara, he stopped reading her expression. "Is it that bad?" he asked. Clara nodded. "People think I'm tainting the children's future." Boone spoke slowly, each word sinking into solid ground. "Clara, you give children something few people here. Do the courage to read, to think, to believe in themselves. No one can take that away from you." Clara gave a weak smile, the kind that only existed when one was standing before someone one truly trusted. "But I don't know how I can stand up to Thomas." Boone stood beside her, not touching, not invading, just close enough so she knew that if the wind blew, he would block the strongest part. "We'll find a way," Boone said. "And whatever happens, I won't let you lose it all. But Boone knew to defy the old territorial law, Clara had only one path, one he had been contemplating all night long. And as dusk fell over the red willow, he walked up to Clara, with words that would change both their fates. The news of Thomas's planned federal lawsuit spread like a wind across dry fields. But for Clara there was something else that had been bothering her all day, the look in Boone's eyes when he told her she wasn't alone. That statement is not a promise. It is more like a testimony that in this vast and sometimes harsh world, there are souls who find each other not through words but through a quiet and steadfast presence. Clara spent her days teaching, but her mind drifted back to the times. Boone stood quietly behind her in times of danger, the times he let her do the heavier work, to help her believe she was strong, and especially the stormy night. The two opened their hearts to each other with memories that were not easy to tell. As dusk fell over Red Willow, the last rays of sunlight spread over the schoolyard like warm honey. The red willow leaves trembled in the gentle breeze, and sparrows sang alone on the old wooden roof. Clara locked the classroom door and saw Boone standing under the schoolyard's only tree. He stood tall, holding his leather cap, his shadow stretching across the ground. The sight made Clara pause, as if time had slowed to make room for something important about to happen. "Boone," she called softly. He turned. The setting sun reflected off Boone's face, highlighting the weathered features of a man who had lost much but still retained a kind gaze. "I'll wait for you," Boone said. Just 3 words, but Clara understood that they carried more than the usual meaning. They walked slowly toward each other. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and warm earth, a familiar scent of the borderlands, the scent of people who lived hand to mouth and hoped they could never see but always feel. Boone stopped a few paces from Clara. He didn't move closer, as if giving her the choice of stepping forward or staying put. A respect few men in those days could match. "Clara," Boone began, his voice deep as a banjo at night. "There's something I need to say before Thomas causes you more pain." Clara clenched her hands, bracing herself for something heavy. But Boone's eyes softened, and his words made her heart skip a beat. "I loved you. From the first day I saw you standing alone on Main Street, divorce papers in hand, but still holding your head up against the whole town." Clara paused, not because of the confession, but because Boone, a man of few words who kept his pain to himself, had let his heart be exposed like that. Boone took a step forward, but kept enough distance so that Clara wouldn't feel pressured. "I love your resilience," he continued. "Love how you stay kind even when life is unkind to you. Love how you stand up for your children and teach them to be brave even when the world is testing you every day." Clara felt her eyes sting slightly, but she didn't cry. Not now. Boone took a deep breath, as if gathering all the courage of a lifetime. "Clara Ellsworth, I want to marry you." The space around them seemed to stop. The afternoon sun was fading, leaving only the last warm rays of light lingering on their hair and eyes. But then Boone continued so slowly, so clearly, and so sincerely that even the wind stopped to listen. "But I will never let the law or another man decide your fate. You will choose me only if your heart desires it. Not for Thomas, not for the land, not for fear of losing everything." He bowed his head slightly, as if bowing before the dignity of the woman standing before him. "Clara, what does your heart say?" Clara couldn't answer right away. Not because she didn't have feelings for Boone, but because the confession was too big, too beautiful, too humane compared to the wounds she still carried in her heart. "Boone," Clara said, her voice trembling but sincere, "I don't know what my heart wants right now. I've lost so much, and I need time to figure out whether I'm standing for myself or leaning on you." Boone nodded, the nod of a man who understood that true love wasn't about possessing, but about waiting. "I understand," he said. "Think about it. I'm not going anywhere." The two stood in silence. No awkwardness, no sadness, just the silence of two hearts finding their way to each other with pain, with hope, and with a trust that takes time to blossom. When Clara turned to go home, the twilight had given way to a soft purple night. Boone stood still, watching, hat in hand, like a guardian of something fragile but precious. Clara didn't look back, but she knew in her heart that if she did, Boone would still be standing there just as he always had been when she needed him. But before Clara can let her heart answer Boone's question, Thomas, with the desperation and spite of someone who has lost everything, begins to unleash a series of coercive attacks that will send the entire town reeling. And Clara will have to confront not only her fears, but the man who once shattered her life. In the days that followed Boone's heartfelt proposal, Clara's heart felt a strange peace. Not the peace that came from a definitive answer, but the warmth of knowing she had a choice, a right to stand in a relationship with dignity, not fear of abandonment. But while the human heart was still groping between recovery and choice, other winds came fiercer and colder than any Montana storm. That afternoon, Clara had just finished school. Children rushed out into the yard like flocks of little birds, chirping and innocent before the adult world had time to burden them. Clara stood under the porch, clutching a stack of notebooks that needed to be graded. Suddenly, from the main road came the sound of horse hooves, the sound of boots hitting the ground, and laughter noise that did not sound like decent people. Clara turned back. Thomas Ellsworth was walking toward the school gates with 3 men who had been his drinking buddies. Men the people of Red Willow generally avoided, not because they were dangerous, but because they were up to no good. Thomas's dirty suit looked even more disheveled next to them. His face was more gaunt than the day before, his eyes drooping with the despair of someone losing control of his own life. Clara Ellsworth Thomas growled loud enough for the whole schoolyard to hear. A few of the children started. One little girl began to tremble, clutching the edge of Clara's dress. Clara put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You can't cause trouble here," Clara said, her voice low but firm. Thomas sneered. "You think you have any standing, Clara? The court will rule in my favor. And I want you off my land before the paperwork is done." Clara looked him straight in the eye. "That land stopped being yours the day you left." The man standing next to Thomas smirked. "What does a woman who has been abandoned by her husband know about rules and regulations?" A chill ran down Clara's spine, but she didn't back down. "Not this time." "Get off the school grounds," she said. "This is a children's place." Thomas took a step forward, his voice choked with anger. "Do you think you can hide behind these children? You will have to face me, Clara. You have no one to protect you." At that, a child near the gate burst into tears, a sob so unsteady that it stopped the group. Clara bent down and took the child in her arms. Her breath was hoarse and choked as she swallowed her fear. Looking at the child, Clara suddenly saw what she had not dared to think about before. Thomas was threatening more than her property. He was threatening the safety of the children and the dignity of the woman she was trying to be. A soft call came from across the street. Clara looked up. Phoebe Marlowe, the woman who had left with Thomas, was standing there. But she was no longer the haughty beauty Clara had last seen her with. Her dress was faded, her hair was disheveled, her face was haggard. Phoebe looked as if she had lived through days she could not even imagine. Thomas turned around. "Are you following me?" Phoebe did not answer Thomas, but walked quickly towards Clara, pulling her into the corner of the wall next to the fence as if afraid someone would hear. "Clara." Phoebe's voice trembled. "You have to be careful. Thomas is not the man you once knew. He's lost everything, and so desperate that he might do something he shouldn't." Clara looked straight at Phoebe. "Why are you telling me this?" Phoebe bit her lip, her eyes flashing with something both vulnerable and brave. "Because I know what it feels like to be used and discarded by him, and I don't want you to go through what I went through." Clara wanted to ask more, but Phoebe backed away, her eyes filling with tears. "Stay away from him if you can, and don't be alone." Then she quickly turned away, as if the very truth she had just said made her weaker. When Clara returned, Thomas was still standing in front of the school gate, the restless look of someone accustomed to power but gradually losing his last support. "You will sign the land back to me," Thomas said again, his voice hard and absurd, like that of someone drunk with despair. Clara stepped forward, standing between Thomas and the children. "No," she said. "I won't sign. You have no more rights in my life." The wind picked up, whipping Clara's clothes, but she stood tall, proud and silent, just as her parents had taught her to be. Luckily, that's when Boone Carter appeared at the end of the road. He approached slowly, not in a hurry, but with a look in his eyes that said he saw danger from afar. There was no gun in his hand, no anger in his gait, but his presence was enough to make the 3 men with Thomas back off a little. Boone stopped beside Clara, as if just standing there was enough to make her no longer alone. "Go home," Thomas Boone said quietly. "She doesn't belong to you anymore." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "You think she belongs to you, Boone?" Boone did not answer immediately. He just looked at Clara and then turned to Thomas. "She belongs to herself, and today she chooses to stand on the side of what is right." The air fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Thomas clenched his jaw, his eyes red like a cornered animal. But then he turned his horse, jerked the reins, and rode away with his companions like a wind across dry land, disorderly and fleet. Clara stood still until the dust cleared. Her heart was filled with fear, exhaustion, and sadness. Sadness for Thomas, the man who had chosen a path that made him small before everyone's eyes. Boone touched her shoulder lightly. "Are you okay?" Clara nodded, but something had changed in her gray eyes. It was no longer the fear of losing ground. It was no longer the pain of being insulted. It was a clear realization this war was no longer about paperwork. It was about survival, about dignity, about whether she could live on with her head held high. "Boone," Clara whispered. "He'll come back, and when he does, I'm not sure I can stop him alone." Boone looked at her for a long moment. His voice was low and steady, like that of a man about to make the biggest decision of his life. "Clara, you will not be alone. Never again." But even with Boone on her side, Clara knows there are battles only she can decide. And that leads Boone to make an unexpected choice, one not to save Clara, but to empower her to shape her own destiny. In the most beautiful way a frontiersman can. After the afternoon, Thomas led a mob to the school gates. Red Willow fell strangely silent, as if the town were holding its breath in anticipation of some unnamed threat. Clara was quieter too, not because she was weak, but because she was listening to herself, something she hadn't had the chance to do in years, when her old married life forced her into voices that weren't her own. But one thing troubled her: Boone was gone. One day, then 2 days. No one saw him at the stables, nor did they find his familiar footprints on the dirt road leading to the small farm by the pine forest. At first, Clara thought Boone had simply gone away on business, but on the third morning, when Mrs. Doyle, the librarian, asked, "Where is Mr. Carter?" Clara felt her heart sink like a gently touched string. She didn't want to admit it, but Boone's absence worried her in a very special way, a worry she didn't even dare name. Where did he go? Did something happen? Or did he leave because she didn't answer? That thought made Clara stand for a long time in the classroom door, looking out toward the eastern hills where Boone often gathered wood. That afternoon, as the last golden sunlight fell on Red Willow, Clara was locking the classroom door when the sound of horse hooves slowly echoed from afar. The sound was not strong, but gentle, as if the rider was considering each step. Clara turned back. Boone Carter was returning road dust on his shoulders, his face tanned, but his eyes as deep and peaceful as a spring. Seeing Clara looking at him, he stopped his horse and got out of the carriage slowly. No words immediately, only a slight nod, as if acknowledging what the past 2 days had left in both of their hearts. "Clara," Boone said, his voice low and husky like the morning wind through the pines, "I want to take you somewhere." Clara nodded. There was something in his voice that made it impossible for her to refuse, not because of debt or responsibility, but because she trusted him as deeply and naturally as she trusted a path she had traveled all her life without knowing it. They headed west of Red Willow, where the land began to slope up and the grass thinned. The sun was low, turning the prairie a burnt copper color. As they reached the foot of the hill, Clara noticed an old, crumbling wooden sign, the words faded by time. "Old Harrington Ranch." Clara sighed softly, not in surprise, but in emotion at the meaningful silence of the place. Harrington Farm had once been the pride of the town's family, but it had been abandoned for nearly a decade after the plague swept through. No one had the strength or the heart to rebuild it. But now, from afar, Clara heard the sound of hammers, the clanging of wood, the deep laughter of the old man, the sound of children running around. She looked at Boone, her eyes wide with confusion. "Boone, what's going on?" Boone did not answer. He simply waved his hand and said, "Go and see." Clara walked down the hill, and the sight that opened before her left her almost speechless. The whole Red Willow community is here. Reverend Harold was repairing the sheepfold door. Mrs. Westwood from the bakery was cleaning out the old kitchen. Morgan the blacksmith was bringing steel plates to reinforce the fence. The children who had been her teachers were running around picking up nails, giggling when she appeared. Everyone worked as if the farm belonged to them, or rather as if they expected it to belong to someone. Clara turned to Boone, her heart pounding in her chest. What are you doing?" Boone stepped in front of her, not touching, not forcing. His voice was soft but firm as the ground. "Clara, this is Old Harrington Ranch. I bought it last week, before Thomas got back." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. "I know you are fighting for your land," Boone continued. But I also know that the fight may not be fair from the start. And I don't want you to be dependent on the law or another man." The afternoon light reflected on Boone's face, making him look as if he were carrying the sunset on his shoulders. "This farm won't replace your land," Boone said slowly, "but it can be a place where we can start over, from scratch, without fear, without it being taken away." He looked straight into Clara's eyes, a gaze like an oil lamp on a stormy night, warm, steady, unwavering. "Clara Ellsworth," Boone said, "this is your choice. You can come with me, rebuild this place. Or you can walk away, and I will respect that decision." He paused for a beat and then said the final sentence, a sentence that made Clara feel as if someone had opened a door in her heart that had been closed for many years. "This place is yours, if you want it. And if your heart doesn't want it, I'll never mention it again." Clara raised her hand to her mouth, not to hold back tears, but to catch her breath, which was ragged with emotion. "This is not a gift. It is not pity. It is not salvation. This was a choice, something Clara had never had given her in her entire life." The tears fell quiet and clear, not heavy, not despair, just deep gratitude, feeling seen, respected, valued. Boone looked at her, slightly worried. "If I upset you," Clara shook her head, stepping closer to him. "No, Boone," she whispered. "You make me human." Boone breathed a sigh of relief, like someone who had just put down a burden he had carried for years. In the distance, children cheered as Pastor Harold erected a large pole in the middle of the yard. The wind blew across the fields, carrying with it the scent of hay and new wood smells that reminded one of a new beginning. Clara turned to look at the farm again, the half-built fence, the half-built roof, the hammering like the heartbeat of a family waiting to be born. And she knew her answer. Not because she was forced to, not because she was afraid of Thomas, but because she saw a future here, a future of her own choosing. But life, even when it opens up to the light, always tests human courage. And just as Clara is about to speak her mind, Thomas appears, carrying the fury of a desperate man, and this time he does not intend to leave quietly. The evening light falls on Old Harrington Ranch, covering it with a deep yellow color, like a warm blanket that nature gives to souls finding their way back after many years of being lost. Clara stood in the middle of the partially rebuilt courtyard, listening to the distant sound of hammers, the laughter of children, and the slow chatter of adults. All these sounds combined to create a feeling that Clara thought she had lost forever, the feeling of belonging. Boone watched her from a few feet away, his eyes quiet and deep, as if he knew his life would change from now on, no matter what Clara said. Clara opened her mouth to speak, to say that her heart had found the answer, when suddenly an angry shout rang out from the eastern slope, "Clara!" The call tore through the quiet afternoon like an arrow piercing the heart. The workers stopped working. The children fell silent. Red dust swirled up with the horses' hooves. Thomas Ellsworth appears. His face was pale with drink and defeat. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair was disheveled, his suit jacket was stained with dirt and sweat. He was no longer the kind man Clara had seen him as. He looked desperate, like someone who had lost everything, and was ready to destroy whatever was left. "You have no say in this," Thomas shouted. "That farm doesn't belong to you. Nothing belongs to you." Clara took a half-step back, but Boone stepped forward, standing lightly in front, no threat, just the calm protection of a man who knew what was right. "Thomas," Boone said low and slow. "That's enough." But Thomas didn't listen. The horse beneath him turned restlessly. The dusk in Thomas's eyes made them look like deep pits, where a man who once had a future had lost his last light. Clara swallowed. Boone turned to look at her, his eyes asking, "Do you want me to stay here?" And with a look, Clara answered yes. Boone took another step toward Thomas. "You've hurt her enough. Leave her alone." Thomas laughed out loud, a broken, defeated laugh. "Calm down." "What does she know about being calmed down? She'll sign the land papers. She'll give me back everything." Clara took a slow breath. The sunset reflected on her face, highlighting her ashen eyes, eyes that had once collapsed, cried silently, been used as objects. But today those eyes were different. They were the color of someone who knew they were worthy. Clara stepped forward. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft but firm, "as the West, you have no power over my life anymore." Thomas growled, "You belong to me." "No." Clara shook her head slowly and firmly. "I used to belong to your words, the decisions you made, the hurts you caused. But today, I belong to myself." The crowd around them fell silent. The Red Willow people who had been whispering, who had been reserved, now formed a circle around Clara and Boone. Reverend Harold took the first step forward. He put his hand on Clara's shoulder. "She belongs to this town more than you ever did, Thomas. Miss Ellsworth is kind to my son," roared Mr. Morgan the blacksmith. "That is enough to make me take your side." "She deserves to live her life," Mrs. Westwood from the bakery said loudly. "No one has the right to take that away." The people of Red Willow, old, young men, women, moved forward, standing between Clara and Thomas. No one was threatening. They just stood there like pillars of a bridge meant to protect those passing through a storm. Thomas looked back at them, then back at Clara, his eyes confused, as if he didn't understand why the entire town was siding with the woman he once despised. Meanwhile, Boone turned to Clara. He did not kneel immediately. He simply looked at her as at the first dawn after a long winter. Then slowly Boone knelt down. No drama, no fanfare, just the act of a man deciding to place his heart in the hands of a woman he respected absolutely. "Clara Ellsworth," Boone said, his voice hoarse but steady, "I want to marry you. Not because of the law, not to save you from anyone, but because of the one thing my heart knows for sure: you are my home." Clara put her hand to her mouth. Her breath caught in her chest, and then, as if all the pain, loss, and humiliation had melted from her shoulders, Clara placed her hand on Boone's. "I choose you," she whispered, so soft it was hard to hear even by someone standing next to her, but strong enough to fill the void in Boone's life. Then she spoke clearly for Thomas and the whole town to hear. "I chose Boone, not because the law forced me to have a man, but because my heart finally knew where it belonged." The evening breeze blew gently, carrying the scent of fresh grass and new wood. The crowd smiled, the smiles of those who had witnessed a soul finding a home. Thomas looked at the scene, his face pale. He wanted to say something, but no words came out. And like an animal finally realizing the fight was over, he turned his horse and rode away, slow, small, lost in the land he had thought was his. As soon as the sun set, the wedding ceremony took place. No alcohol, no big party. There was only oil lamps, tired but warm smiles, and two hands holding each other firmly like an unspoken oath. It was the most beautiful sunset Red Willow had ever seen. Not because of the color of the sky, but because two people had found dignity, kindness, and a home built with hearts, not rules or prejudices. But sunset is only the beginning, and when the first dawn breaks over Harrington Ranch, once desolate and silent, Clara and Boone will begin a new life. A life built with two hands, two hearts, and the belief that even in the harshest land, life can still blossom. The sunset on Clara and Boone's wedding day was not as picturesque or as noisy as weddings in the Far East. But for the people of Red Willow, it was an afternoon not to be forgotten. The last rays of sunlight bathed the newlyweds like warm honey, and the wind from the distant prairie whispered the blessing of heaven to souls reunited after a lifetime of loss. But real life, as it were, began soon after the happy day. And that life, though not easy, was what Clara treasured most. Old Harrington Ranch, once a desolate wasteland in the middle of a wind-swept prairie, is being transformed by the tenacious hands of two indomitable men. Early the morning after the wedding, Clara awoke to the sound of wooden wheels rolling across the yard and the smell of Boone coffee boiling in a black iron pot. Light filtered through the small window, illuminating the face of her husband, a man whose features had been carved by time, but who retained the quiet kindness Clara had loved since before she knew it. "Here's coffee," Boone said, placing the steaming cup before her. His voice was hoarse, but there was something so warm about it that Clara felt protected not by force but by presence. They start their day like this, simple, slow, without many words. Boone spends his mornings down at the ranch's old well, where he and a few friends are trying to revive a spring that was filled years ago. With each dip he hears echoes of the past, a past that's silent but never quite dead. Clara stood above her hands on the well wall and asked, "Do you think the well is still usable?" Boone looked up, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Water is always somewhere, Clara. It's just a matter of someone having the patience to look for it." That saying, Clara knew, was not just about wells. Sure enough, on the 12th day, the first spring of water came up, not a strong stream, just a clear stream that seeped into the bucket's mouth, but enough to make the whole farm cry out in small but heartfelt joy. And then spring truly came to Old Harrington Ranch. The wild apple orchard behind the house sprouted again, each green shoot as soft as a child's palm. Clara tended them with the care of someone who had once feared she would break anything, but had now learned that beautiful things often come from old wounds. Boone came from the barn, his hair caught in the sun. "The apples are going to be good this year," he said. Clara chuckled. "Do you say that every year?" Boone shook his head. "No, but this year is different. This farm has a real owner." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "We are both masters, Boone." And in that moment Clara realized she had not only found a home but also found herself a woman who had once been suffocated by prejudice, now able to hold her head up in the vast prairie without fear of judgment. Not only did Clara tend the farm, but she also did something that deeply touched the people of Red Willow. She sold her old homestead to a young widow with 2 small children. She, Sarah Lindell, was as battered by life as Clara had been. When Sarah burst into tears, saying that she could not pay the full price, Clara simply placed her hand lightly on the woman's. "You pay by living a decent life. That's enough." The word spread through town like a little story of kindness, a quiet, unsung kindness that soothed the harshness that Montana threw at its people. Their new rhythm of life was slow, steady, and beautiful, like an old Western song. In the mornings, the smell of coffee on the iron stove filled the kitchen. Clara toasted cornbread. Boone chopped wood. And sometimes they said nothing, for the silence between lovers has its own sound. In the afternoons, Clara tended the apple orchard. Boone tended the stables or took the colts out to pasture behind the hill. When the first horses bred well, Boone put his hand on the neck of a foal and said softly, "This is a good sign for our future." Clara stood beside him, clutching the edge of her coat, feeling her heart as light as the wind. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Clara knitted a scarf. Boone played a few short songs on his old banjo, an instrument he rarely played in public, but which he gave to Clara as a silent gift. The fire in the fireplace flickered, reflecting on both their faces, making the small house look like a place where time had stopped to give love a place to stay. Then one day in early summer, when the sun was still soft and the wind still carried the scent of young grass, Clara placed her hand on her belly, where a life was stirring gently. She stood still for a long time, a warm feeling rising like a small wave in her heart. She did not rush to tell Boone. It was just a private moment between her and the unborn child, but it had already given her new confidence. That evening, as Boone was building the fire, Clara stepped closer and placed Boone's hand on her belly. His touch was very gentle as if afraid to injure something sacred. Boone looked up at Clara, his eyes filled with a light she had never seen before, grateful, trembling, and too happy to speak. A long while later, he uttered the words that Clara carried with her for the rest of her life. "Thomas didn't just leave the gold. He paved the way for me to find the rarest treasure of my life." Clara smiled, leaning her head on Boone's shoulder. Outside, the wind blew across the meadow, brushing the roof like a blessing from the sky. And so in the midst of that windy and harsh land, 2 broken people built a new life together, not perfect but complete. Not rich but full in the way their hearts understood. A life built on kindness, choice, and the courage to love again from the beginning and from the same old wounds. Amidst the dusty story of the late 19th century frontier, Clara Ellsworth's journey reminds us of something that seems old but never loses its value. Human dignity lies not in what others give you, but in how you rise from seemingly unbearable losses. Clara was betrayed, stripped of her home, her honor, and her belief in herself. But it was from these ruins that she learned to move on with her own 2 feet. Relearned the value of kindness, and opened her heart to receive a love that comes from respect, not from giving. The important message is, life will always have moments when a door closes and it hurts, but sometimes it is the way to open a new path, where the heart is seen, heard, and truly appreciated. We cannot choose who leaves us, but we can choose how we live. In modern life, amidst all the pressure, sometimes what we need most is not a miracle but perseverance, kindness, and the belief that we deserve better. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. If you feel the warmth or find some strength for yourself, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to bring healing stories from the Wild West to your heart.